Okay, hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar where I'm really going through one of the Behaviour Management 101 type topics, and that is proactive versus reactive behaviour management strategies or behaviour management techniques. Obviously there is a slight difference between strategies and techniques and skills, things like that. I just use the word strategies most of the time, so if I start talking about any of those terms, then just remember that they all mean basically the same thing. They are things that we go about doing as teachers or teacher aides or other educational professionals in order to help manage, control, prevent behavioural issues of our students that come from our students. So that generally means primary school or high school. Of course, a lot of these apply or are good to know if you're actually teaching adults as well. I teach a lot of adults and these do come in handy from time to time. Not so much because adults are going out of their way to be difficult or challenging, but if you are working with large groups of people, then there is always one or two people who are a little more chatty or are there to socialise. So if you're a trainer, then this video might come in handy. Take out the bits and pieces that works for you. If you're working with year 1s, 2s, right up to year 11 and 12, then this video is a must watch, particularly if you're working in challenging schools. Now, the basic premise behind behaviour management is that first and foremost you need to think about the different ways in which you plan to prevent behaviour management, behavioural issues from coming about or being something that you have to deal with in the first place. Now, this is why we divide this topic, or I like to divide this topic into two separate categories, and that is the proactive side of things. And again, that's where we divide what we're doing. That's where we start thinking about behaviour management just like we do our teaching strategies or our instructional design strategies. So if we get told that we're going to teach these students, we have to decide as a part of that planning process how we are going to go about teaching them. Are we going to use explicit instruction? Are we going to use play-based instruction? Are we going to use whole part whole learning? What scaffolds are we going to use? Are we going to use guided learning, shared learning? Is it a literacy type thing where we're going to be spending more time on the language and literacy continuum? If it's a phonics type instruction or anything in between, and as a combination, how are we going to go about combining all these different strategies together, and what that means for us in terms of developing resources and setting up the room or setting up that group and the time frames. And also all of these things are based on our goals, because that's one of the first things that we try and figure out. What do we want to achieve? Now, I think that as, I guess, a bit of an analogy is also apparent in behaviour management, and forethought and planning and systems are really, really important. And this is the big difference between teachers and teacher aides that have been well trained and have quite a bit of experience, and teachers and teacher aides, trainers or whatnot, that haven't really been trained in this area properly, or haven't done a lot of reading in this area, and really struggle. Novice teachers in particular really struggle with behaviour management, and there's two reasons why that is a problem. Firstly, we all know and regularly hear in the media that about 50 to 70% of teachers leave in the first few years of their career, and the number one reason for that is behaviour management. Or it's actually not behaviour management, it's behaviour, stress, anxiety, all these types of things, which is created by, in my opinion at least, a significant lack of behaviour management skills. Now, that's not because that's not because that person is any less of a teacher or any less of a teacher aide, but because they just don't get taught this stuff in most courses. And that's why we put a massive emphasis on it. And trust me, from experience, having spent a lot of time at university studying, research, I can tell you that teachers learn almost nothing when it comes to behaviour management. And in fact, they are often taught by people who have not worked in a school, and particularly they have not worked in challenging schools. And I know this because when I first graduated, I was useless at behaviour management, and it was very, very stressful. Now that I've been teaching for quite some time, and even though I don't teach kids full time like a lot of people watching this video will, I can tell you that the more you learn about behaviour management, the better you will get at teaching across the board. And even for teacher aides, it's really important that you can provide support at the highest level possible, because quite often you'll be working with teachers who are not strong on behaviour management. That can be the reason why you get put into that class. Now, for teachers or teacher aides, we don't have 20 years of full-time experience to try and sort this stuff out through trial and error and the occasional PD or meeting or whatever. We want to figure out how to do it now so that we can practice it over the next year or so and become an absolute ace at behaviour management. The other reason for why behaviour management is really important, because if you remember I said there were two reasons. One is, of course, it causes a huge amount of stress and whatnot. The second thing is because there is a direct correlation, and research shows this consistently over the last 30 or 40 years. There is a significant and direct correlation between behaviour management and the amount of time students spend on learning. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, you will know that I have also spoken about some very recent research out of the US that has said that approximately, or generally speaking, teachers spend around about 60% of their time teaching when they're on class. Now that means that other 40%, something else is going on, and I can guarantee you that it's probably behaviour management or behaviour management related. So with that in mind, and as a little introduction to behaviour management as far as why it's so important and how much of an effect it can have in the classroom. Sorry, that's the next point I wanted to get to. I'm jumping ahead. I just want to draw a little graphic, I guess, to show why using proactive strategies is so important. Because when I first started teaching, and I know this is the case for pretty much all teachers, as well as for teacher aides who are walking into class for the first time, the general inclination, if you don't know anything about behaviour management or you haven't been taught properly, is that you will only use reactive strategies. You might use the occasional proactive, but if you're like me, you were never even taught this word when you were at university. And in fact, the other day as I was preparing this, I started looking into the curriculum that the universities are teaching, and they're not teaching this at all. So let me just do a quick little graphic to explain why proactive is so important and why you should spend a significant chunk of your time thinking about using more and more proactive strategies, because that means at the end of the day, you don't have to use these. This is where things get stressful and learning time gets eaten into. I'll use a different colour pen actually. So in terms of proactive strategies, the graph is actually very simple, and in my book I go through this. I wrote probably 20 pages on this type of stuff at the very start. And you'll find, actually, I was just flicking through it a minute ago, that the majority of strategies that I talk about are actually proactive. And that's because there's very limited things that we can do once a student actually misbehaves. If a student stands up, kicks a chair, walks out the room, we really only have 2 or 3 things that we can do there, probably only really 1 or 2. We could say some different things or whatnot, but we're very limited in what we can do. Whereas on the proactive side of it, there's probably 200 things we can do in advance of that happening, or in different ways that we can go about trying to prevent that from happening. The other thing I will point out is that a lot of the modern sort of trendy programs that are out these days for behaviour management, such as school-wide positive behavioural supports and PBS, which is a very similar, basically the same thing, sort of the same thing. And you've also got even applied behaviour analysis, which is a little bit older but still used, particularly with students with disabilities. And a lot of those programs that use that word positive, because that's the trendy sort of thing to do these days, that'll pass. As with all these programs, they come and they go and new ones replace it. But what I like to teach my students is that these concepts are universal and they work with every type of program that you're going to meet in a school. So if you're working within a school-wide positive behaviour support program at the moment, which is a very effective way of managing behaviour, it's pretty much 100, it's probably 95% proactive, but eventually that'll get replaced by another program with a new fancy name. And again, it will, as all the last 20 or 30 programs that have been popular, it will be basically relying on proactive strategies. So that's why I think, as a bit of a side note, it's very important to not learn about a particular program or be too concerned about a particular program that comes out, regardless of how fancy the name sounds, but to really be thinking about the core strategies that go behind that. Okay, so we've got our simple graph here. Now there's nothing spectacular about this, but basically this is just a basic simple trend line, and this isn't based in any research or anything, by the way, so don't quote me on this one. Now, effectively, I've drawn that around the wrong way. That's why I was confused. This is across the bottom, we have the number of proactive strategies going in that direction. So let's say 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. The time scale doesn't really matter. And up here we've got, in the book I call it severity and frequency, because they are two different things. And the reason for that is when we start looking at collecting data for behaviour management purposes, we look at severity and frequency. That's one of the two main things that we look at there. So as we use more and more proactive strategies, the severity and frequency goes down almost in a perfect line like that. So let's say you're using, let's say these are in lots of 5, 10, actually that's probably a bit high. Let's just call it low, medium and a high number, something along those lines. Now, obviously, let's call this the same, low, medium, high, extremely high. This is career-ending high up here. This is workers' compensation, mental breakdown type high, right? So, quite clearly, for those that aren't really that into reading graphs and things, but I love doing these little graphs because I think it explains it very well, and it means you get to look at something instead of my ugly face staring at the screen all day. So, you've got, if you're using a low number of proactive strategies, as in you're not really thinking in advance, you're just going onto class and going, okay, I might just wait and see what happens, and if students are loud or annoying or they're throwing things or getting out of the seat or whatever, then I'm going to do something about it. So at this end, the number of, the number, which is your frequency, and the severity, as in the seriousness of the behavioural issues, so that's behavioural issues, is going to be somewhere up here. It's going to be really high. Now, obviously this depends on, I always put this disclaimer into these videos or the discussions I have when talking about behaviour management, because some people come from, well, we all come from different classes or different experiences. Now, if you're working in a really cosy school, then great. These videos are important and you will get a lot out of them. But if you don't use that many proactive strategy and you're teaching year 12 and a really good class of year 12 students who are university bound and they're very motivated to study to get into their exams or whatever, and year 10s, 11s, 12s are all relatively similar. You can tell the difference, but they're relatively similar. Then this isn't really going to make a huge amount of sense to you. But if you're teaching in a public school, year 9, year 6, this is going to make much more sense. So just bear in mind that context that you're actually coming from, and that this is obviously going to change depending on who you're teaching and also the types of topics and things like that you're teaching too. So, but as a concept, it should apply across the board. For those that are working in very, very what I call challenging classes, then behaviour management is much more important to you, and in fact it becomes a central thing that you do and think about. But for those that don't have that much of a problem, you need to know about it, but it's not something that should take up huge amounts of time. Anyway, so let's say you've decided, you started watching some of these videos and you're learning a little bit about proactive behaviour management strategies, and you start thinking, well, I'm going to do a seating plan and I'm going to start building some rapport with students. I'm going to set very clear expectations. I'm going to start circulating. You introduce 4 or 5 different proactive strategies and whatever it is, and let's say you start functioning here, and straight away you know that these are going down. Now, again, as I keep saying, from experience, I can tell you, as someone who's taught every grade from K to 12 and been really bad at behaviour management, particularly in my first few years of teaching, that this is exactly what happens. Because as I was finally starting to realise that behaviour management is even a thing that you can learn about and improve and whatnot, and started doing PDs and watching videos and actually I don't think there was even any videos back then, just doing PDs and reading books and things. Every time I introduce stuff, sometimes I start doing a new strategy and it had 0 effect or very, very little. But then other times I would start doing something new and it would just have this massive effect. And straight away you would see the severity and frequency just drop out of sight. So that doesn't mean it's got to drop from up here if you've got a really tough year 9 or year 8 class of 32 kids or whatnot, particularly in a classroom like second language or maths or something where the kids don't want to be there, but you are going to see it drop quite a lot. It's not going to drop to here straight away. I mean, very rarely. It's possible, right? But no single strategy or even 2 or 3 strategies is going to mean that the severity and frequency of behaviour is going to drop to here. So now, not just working as a teacher, but also working as a teacher aide, there are 2 things that are relevant and important here. 1, you need to know this because you need to know what's going on in your class so you can provide support. But 2, there are heaps of strategies that are proactive and reactive that you can also implement. So not only are you able to suggest certain strategies, but you're actually able to implement a lot of proactive strategies. And when we go through something of a list of those, and there's hundreds of them, I think I go through somewhere between 80 strategies in my book about behaviour management, but in actual fact, some of those strategies go through 10 or 15 sort of sub-strategies. So there probably are literally hundreds of different things that I can think of off the top of my head, and certainly I don't claim to know every single strategy out there, so you'll know some that I'm not even aware of. That, again, if we're dealing with people, there's always other little tricks we can pick up as we go. So anyway, point is, there are dozens of these that you'll be able to add to your tool belt that you can pull out and use as needed. These are not necessarily planning type things, although that is also the case. That is the case a lot of the time with proactive, but it's not only the case. Only probably a small percentage of proactive strategies involve some type of planning. A lot of these proactive stuff we do in class. And with reactive, we actually plan a lot of reactive strategies. In fact, we probably spend more time planning reactive strategies because that's where things can go wrong and where we can get stressed out and where it eats into learning and all this kind of stuff. So we probably spend more time planning this than we actually do planning that. Maybe it's about the same, really depends, but don't make the assumption that this is for teachers and this is for teachers and teacher aides. That's absolutely not the case. Okay, anyway, so obviously the aim here then is to get the severity and frequency of issues down as low as we can possibly get. Now, if you walk into a class, you'll be able to plot where you're at on this particular graph. And if you're in a few classes, so you're going from class to class, let's say you're in year 8 or 9 or something, and you do maths here, and then you go over here and you're doing this. If you're a teacher aide and you've got a focus student that you follow from this class to this class or whatever, you'll be able to plot this, even just in your head. You don't have to do it on a graph, but if in your head you start thinking, well, I actually reckon we're about here, or I reckon maybe we're about here, or wherever it is. Generally we'll be following that line, right? But so the chances are that the number of proactive strategies is quite low at the moment. So if you're on a class at the moment or you're doing a prac for a course or whatever, start thinking about the number of proactive strategies. What's a colour I haven't used? And there's a good chance that it fits into this little box, right? So it'll be in there somewhere. Well, obviously not down there, but it'll be in here somewhere. And given that, it means that you're going to have to be on this line, on that bit there. What's a colour I haven't used? Purple. No, I just used purple. Green? Yeah, anyway, it's going to have to be on that part of that particular trend line because, well, it can't be over here. So at some point, you're going to have to start thinking about how we can get that line or get that point that you're on. If you're here or if you think you're more so there. If you're there, then great, but you want to get it down to somewhere down here. So you want to move, you don't want to have that amount of total issues. Now, here we're talking about, remember we were also talking about behaviours of concern. This is where that happens. So these are our behaviours of concern. Now they are going to happen anyway. I've got a video on that, it's called Types of Behaviour. Your behaviours of concern are your more serious issues. They are going to happen anyway, but again, you want to reduce it down. So you could think of this graph as a graph of behaviour in general, or you could think of this graph as a graph on behaviours of concern. Or you could think of it as a graph on just your plain old disruptive behaviours. Quite often it's a little bit of a combination of both. If you don't have too many behaviours of concern, which I'd say you probably will because of that, the number one behaviour of concern that you get is highly repetitive behaviour. So the student who's doing the same thing over and over again. If it's not caused by a disability or disorder, then it becomes a behaviour of concern because that small annoying thing is actually then defiance. So again, I've got another video called Root Causes of Behaviour. So in that scenario, if a student is misbehaving multiple times, they know they're not supposed to be, it's not caused by some type of neurological disability or whatnot, and even then it might be worth considering because one of the messages I always get across, having taught a lot of students with disabilities and disorders, is that it is wrong to always attribute behaviour to a student's disability or disorder. I think we do a disservice to students when we naturally assume that if a student with a disability or disorder is misbehaving, therefore that behaviour is caused by some aspect of that diagnosis. And that's not always the case. Sometimes they're just being kids, just like kids who don't have a disability misbehave. So I hope that concept is sort of easy to understand, but I think it's important to separate that out. Is this a behaviour directly caused by the disability, or is it kind of just a bit of a tedious, is it more of a personality thing or whatnot, or should we be attributing it and continually reinforcing that sort of behaviour by saying, well, it's unacceptable, but because it's related to your disability, then what can we do about it? Anyway, so I can't remember what we're talking about. I just want to do a second graph regardless. I lost my train of thought there. Now, if you were to use, let's call this one down here weeks, so over a period of time, and let's call this one here frequency. Now, if you were to use lots of reactive strategies, only reactive strategies, say, over a period of weeks, let's say this is a school term, and I'm being very generalist here, right? But this is, again, just to give you an idea of why we use so many proactive strategies. And in actual fact, we need to get the reactive right as well, because a lot of the time, the strategies that we're using here just aren't that effective, or that we see in classes and things. So not only do we have a lot of people who are using a lot of ineffective reactive strategies and zero of them, what we then need to do is make this effective and that effective, or at least add it in and then make it effective as well, and then show and start practicing in a way that combines them. So that's also just another aspect to that. When we look at teachers or teacher aides who are really struggling with behaviour, that's, I guess, sort of a multi-pronged approach. We kind of look at the reactive ones that are happening. Usually look at proactive first, actually, but say we start with reactive and we make sure we get them right. We've got enough of them, and those that are being used are appropriate, and we've got the vocabulary and terminology around it as well, because that's important. And the proactive side, we make sure, again, it actually exists, and if it does exist, which quite often it doesn't, then we look at how to improve it or how to add to the number of proactive strategies that are available, that are at our disposal, that we are regularly using. So if you are only using reactive strategies, then basically that graph goes like that. That pen's not working. So over time, as we know, behaviour gets worse, generally speaking. Sometimes it plateaus out. Sometimes it starts here and kind of plateaus out. And the frequency of it, the amount of times it is happening, generally gets worse over time because we know that behaviour trends. So if you've got students who are calling out in class and you don't address that, and the only thing you do is put in consequences, so it's a reactive strategy, or the only thing you do is reprimand that student or whatnot, then that frequency is only going to increase. Now, sometimes that might not be so extreme. It might kind of be like that, or it might even be like that. But either way, it's not a trend that we want to see. And even if it goes up like it does, and then it trends across in that sort of direction and it plateaus out, then that might be slightly better. It means that maybe your reactive strategies that you started to implement at this point are probably going okay. And it means the student doesn't, or maybe the student is getting reward for their behaviour that suits their needs. But either way, we still don't want to see that frequency up at that sort of level. We want to see the frequency down here somewhere. So the only way to achieve that is with proactive strategies. So we cannot just get away with reactive strategies. That's what this sort of little graphic shows. If you're only going to use that, you're only ever reactive to what's happening, you're not proactive, then you're only ever going to be able to get that frequency down to a certain level, even over a period of time. Now, the same goes though, however, there's this sort of idea that proactive is the best, we should only use proactive. And if you look at a lot of those new programs out there, extremely proactive, they might talk a little bit about this, and they usually do, but they de-emphasize it a lot. If you don't have reactive in your bag of tricks, then this graph is almost going to look like that as well, because you have to have proactive and reactive strategies. You can't have them separately. It's not a versus thing. That's how it's usually described, but it's not a versus thing. It's a sort of a culmination, I guess, of the two. They come together to help each other. So we can't only just plan stuff and then not do anything in the real world, and then not react when students actually respond to your different strategies and techniques and so forth. We have to have some type of response there. Okay, and of course, the best strategies in the world, there is some research out that has shown that strategies just don't work with all kids. Some kids, it doesn't matter what you do, they just don't react. So this idea, again, another assumption built into these sort of programs that you might come across in schools is that it works for all kids. It does not work for all kids. Some kids have to be managed. Some kids have oppositional defiant disorders or various different iterations of those types of things, or symptoms and signs that come from a disability and whatnot, in which case we approach them in a different way. But even for neurotypical and non-disabled students, there are just some students who, no matter how many different types of strategies you put at them, is not going to solve their problem. We can try and reduce it, but it's not going to solve it. And we can try various different temporary things, but at the end of the day, there are some students where we just want to survive the year effectively. For those, obviously, we're using as many proactive as we can, but we don't set stupid or unachievable goals. Okay, so if we were to use a combination of proactive and reactive strategies, as I was saying, what ends up happening over a school term or a semester, and as far as frequency goes, is firstly, we generally don't see too many issues in the first couple of weeks. Even in those very difficult classes, we generally don't see too many issues. So what ends up happening is, around about week 2 or so, students become you get that 10% of students suddenly think, I'm going to try this on, I'm going to see how I go. I don't feel like doing this work. I don't mind the teacher, but now's the time where I'm thinking, I don't want to get involved in this particular maths thing. I'd rather get kicked out of class, or I feel comfortable now that I've been here for a while that I reckon I could try and get a bit more attention and get get all these my other friends looking at me and whatnot. So this is where you might have a little bit of a spike, say week 2 or 3. It's very rarely going to be week 1 unless students already know each other. But let's just say for a normal class, it could happen any time, but let's say about week 2, it's also the time where the teachers and the teacher aides start relaxing a little bit. So we know the students now, they're pretty well behaved, we get along with them, they seem like nice kids. All right, let's give them a bit more freedom and start doing some different instructional strategies and whatnot. Boom, we have behavioural problems. Now, if you're using a lot of proactive strategies, it might take a little bit of time before you figure out what's going on. I mean, maybe you'll jump onto it straight away. Quite often students will effectively try it on for a little bit. And then eventually over time you start using more reactive, more proactive, and you start thinking about what's going on. Because that's the other thing with proactive is that we might not be using those proactive strategies here for this particular behaviour or these types of behaviour because we weren't expecting them, right? And then here it happens a week or so later, we're like, okay, we need to put something in place here. We start thinking of more proactive strategies. Because we're implementing proactive strategies, that means our reactive strategies are going to change as well, right? And there's various different reasons for this, but as I was saying before, if the surface behaviour is repetitive, so if the surface behaviour is something simple like getting out of your seat or calling out, but it happens a lot, then the actual root cause becomes defiant behaviour, which means we treat that behaviour in a very different way. So anyway, watch the video on the root causes of behaviour because that'll make a bit more sense if that went a little bit over your head there, because we need to know that in this sense for this graph here, because we're going to change the reactive strategies that we're using based on additional information about what actually the root cause was as opposed to what the surface behaviour is that we have observed. So I hope that makes sense. By about week 4 or 5 is where we start figuring out what's going on. And now sometimes, I'm just going to leave that open there, sometimes it drops off. Sometimes we will probably hopefully see it kind of go like this and eventually disappear to that point of near extinction, but sometimes not. Again, sometimes students just need to be managed and it just continues and we put it into, actually it'll never continue like that. What'll end up happening in the real world, it'll drop down, it'll go across, it'll go up, it'll go down, it'll go up, it'll go down, and hopefully you'll finally figure out something that works and it'll float somewhere around there. So it might pop up every now and then and so forth. Maybe, and for some things you will get rid of it completely, but I'm thinking about those students who are particularly, well, the most difficult students that you'll deal with outside of the disability disorder world are the chronic attention seekers and the chronic escape avoiders. So they're the ones that want to be kicked out of class and all that kind of stuff, or they don't want to be there. They still attend every day, but they don't want to be there. So they're the most difficult ones to deal with and the ones that are always misbehaving because by being, while they're going through any of those processes and consequences that you put in place, it means that they're not doing work. So they have that reward that they're seeking. Anyway, which is why for these ones, that little graph looks something along those lines. For other students though, it might just look like that and it might go up. You might think, oh, it's a one-off event, something's gone wrong. And then it happens for a day and then it's back and it's gone and it's never going to happen again. So for those one-off events, then that's not a problem. Frequency might be here. So they might be trying something on, but it's not an ongoing problem that we have to be too worried about. Obviously, we can think about our proactive strategies here for if it does happen again, but quite often quickly initiating a proactive strategy can mean that it disappears quite fast. So, okay, now I just wanted to go through one other little thing, one other little graph before I'll actually get on and I figured I would just talk about the different types of strategies or kind of stress them as I went instead of writing a list of this is what proactive is and this is what reactive means. I think that's relatively obvious and I've already probably given you 15 examples so far, but I will do something of a list in a minute just so you can quite clearly see the differences. So I just wanted to do one little extra graph because I want to really ram home how important this is. And that's because, well, one of the reasons is I think sometimes I guess sometimes when I say proactive is important, we've got to do more proactive, yada, 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 that people watch this and think, okay, well, it is, or they read things that I've written. And then when you actually talk to them, they haven't then gone about and actually implemented these. So it's one of those things why people will agree that it's true, and then once you step back into your class and you're busy and you're running around and whatnot, these sort of drop by the wayside a little bit, particularly if as time goes on and you start forgetting about that video that you watched Adam do a couple of months ago, 5 months ago, 7 months ago, and so forth. So I really wanted to ram home the importance of proactive strategies. All the research since the 60s, 70s, very, very clear that more proactive works. but also logically makes sense. And it makes sense in every industry, whether you're building buildings or whether you're doing some type of environmental thing, or you're a lawyer, or you're running a business or whatever. The more proactive you can be, because this is risk averse. That's what this is. This is identifying all those risks and figuring out the risk of behaviour, the risk of learning time being reduced, so forth. So this is a risk averse strategy. The more you can do of that, the less you have to do of that. I think that's relatively obvious. I don't think that really is anything that would shock too many people, but yet after we've gone through and explained it and read about it and so on and so forth, people seem to really concentrate on this area and forget about that. So that's why we just wanted to emphasize that a little bit. So just one other thing that I wanted to wanted to explain is that actually we might need a little bit more room for this one. Oh no, that should be okay. So there are actually 4 different categories of behaviour management techniques. So obviously proactive goes at the very start here. There's another category that I like to call active, and I'll explain what these are in a minute, and I'll draw each of these using different pens. Reactive. And the last one is post-active. Right, so as you can see, I've added in 2 extra categories. So we've added in active and we've added in post-active. Now, these are the most important, proactive and reactive, and what everyone talks about all of the time. I've just added these in for this little diagram just to help you sort of think chronologically or in a time scale what happens. Because as with anything we do, it's a bit of a, well, in this case, it's not a spectrum, it's a bit of a time thing, right? So time goes that way. Oh, that's a horrible. Time goes that way. So we start here and we end there. Now, this isn't, say, a day or anything. This is the time scale from which we think about behaviour and react to it in very different ways. So proactive is something that happens before the actual behaviour happens, and that can be a minute before. In the case of proximity or whatever, it can be 5 minutes before, it can be a month before. It can happen the week before as you're going through and planning your different instructional strategies and behavioural strategies and so forth. So proactive happens in advance of everything that is going on. And anything in this realm here, so this happens before. But this bit here is where it happens during, and this bit is after. Okay, so I am an English teacher, I swear to God. So this happens before the behaviour happens, in advance, a minute in advance, a month in advance. I think we've gone through that quite comprehensively. And active, however, is what happens during the actual process. Because in this sort of model, it's quite simple. It is a case of this happens before and this is what happens after the behaviour. But there's also that active type category where we're behaving or we're reacting to behaviour not afterwards, not after. So we haven't witnessed it, observed it, and then decided to do something about it. It's during the process of it unfolding. So it started, and the classic example of that is if a student is having a meltdown. So during that process, we are being kind of reactive, but reactive typically means what we do after something has occurred. So there is that active behaviour management strategies, probably more closely related to reactive, but then when I start going through and explaining some of those, you'll be able to see how that some of those proactive strategies actually get used during that active phase as well. So as the behaviour is happening. If noise is an issue in your class and you notice that it's milledecibels, whatever the term is, I just made that up, away from being too loud, you want to cull it straight away. In a way you're being reactive, but you're also doing it just before it starts to become a problem. So that's where it's active. It's kind of during the process of the behaviour. And because the behaviour is unfolding, that changes the way in which we deal with it. If you're dealing with upset students, for example, we're not so much being reactive, but we're not being proactive. We're kind of somewhere in the middle because there may have already been, the student might already be off task or they're not concentrating or doing anything. They have no intention of doing anything. They're in a certain mood or whatnot. We're sort of using some proactive and some reactive strategy. So I just like to use that term. I like to use that sort of active term because it shows that it's in motion. And that's quite often where you get this back and forth between students where there's these escalations and things. You've got your reactive strategies and you've got your post-active strategies. Now, the post-active strategies are the ones that happen well after we've reacted. So these reactive means student misbehaves and we do a correction or whatnot, or we say, Johnny, don't do that. So that's a reactive strategy. But something also happens at the very end, say after class or the next week or whatnot. And this then means we're actually being proactive. Again, so you can see how proactive, it almost like it starts again, because if the behaviour was concerning enough or repetitive enough, or even if you just have an idea of a way to prevent it from ever happening again, you can start doing a post-active strategy, which is more aligned or similar to being proactive. But with proactive, we're predicting what's going to happen. With post-active, we've reacted to it, we've dealt with it, and now we're thinking, well, we don't want it to happen again, right? So let's think of ways in which we can use those proactive strategies, sometimes at the same time as us being reactive or very close proximity. But quite often this involves that formal sitting down and thinking through things afterwards. So it kind of is it's kind of after. So that's why we call that after. But reactive happens after, but post-active happens after, if that makes sense. And then therefore, it kind of becomes a proactive strategy in another sense. Now, the other thing I'll point out about this, again, I'm just trying to prove that using more proactive is important, and even though I'm rambling, but hopefully this will just drill it home about why using more proactive is important. And that's not to say you shouldn't use more reactive, but the benefits of proactive are without a doubt significant. And that's because at this end of the scale, as we've sort of explained up here, these take up the least amount of time. And then when we come across here, so the least amount of time is here. So if we're in that proactive sort of space, as far as our time, we have to think about things in advance. And the least amount of time, least amount of stress. And, well, I mean, ultimately, right, they're the easiest. Least amount of time, least amount of stress, and the easiest. And as we go in that direction, maybe with the exception of right up here, because again, that proactive becomes, that post-active becomes actually reactive, then that least amount of time becomes the most time, stress, and difficulty. Right? Particularly, I mean, if things have already happened, if students have already been in trouble, you have to spend specific time dealing with those types of things. It's a lot easier just to have a simple little plan in place and an idea of what to do in advance. So ideally, we want to do as many proactive as we can and prevent things from getting down this line. Sometimes we can stop behaviour pretty early. Sometimes it goes all the way through to the end of that sort of, I don't know what you would call that. I guess it's a timeline. Yeah, I guess it's a timeline. I'm not sure. I'm no statistician or mathematical genius, that's for sure. Okay, so next thing I wanted to do is just a quick little list, nothing spectacular, of a bunch of proactive strategies and a bunch of reactive strategies. Again, noting that these two other categories here, so we've got category 1, category 2, category 3, category 4, noting that there is significantly overlap between the two, particularly when you've got these ones here, so they definitely overlap like that. So those two, there's a big overlap there. And so they sort of overlap with their neighbours in a way, like that. So there's a bit of a crossover. I don't know if you can even read that, it looks a bit messy, but we'll get rid of all of this anyway. So there is a bit of an overlap, but like anything we do, if we divide it up into little neat categories, then we can use those when we're developing classroom systems. This thing doesn't want to rub off. We can use that when we're developing classroom systems and so on and so forth. So, old whiteboard. I've had this whiteboard for 10 years or something, I think. Might be time to get a new one by the sounds of it. Okay, so just quickly, we want to do a list of proactive strategies. Now, I've got plenty of videos that go through all of these, so there's no surprises here. And if you've done any PDs before, you will have seen a lot of it, particularly the reactive strategies. But the proactive strategies, the stock standard one, obviously rapport building is important. And again, that is evidence-based. There's a lot of research that shows that, and it just makes logical sense. And if you've worked with kids before, you would know the more students like you, the less they're going to misbehave. It's very, very simple. May not work for every student, obviously, but it definitely does work. Your instructional strategies is a huge one. I quite often say that when teachers say, oh, I've got this horrible class, first thing that comes to mind is, well, what are you doing curriculum-wise? What are your instructional strategies and so on and so forth? So are you using fast-paced classes, short, sharp activities? Is that the not sign for equal? Not doing the set and circulate method, for example. Are you using lots of games, quizzes, motivational strategies, so on and so forth? So I've got 50, 60 videos on instructional strategies that go through lots of different options there. Hopefully this one rubs off. But yeah, that'll give you an idea as far as instructional strategies are concerned. Obviously we have systems. So we want to put as many systems and processes in place as we possibly can. We're thinking about matching the minimal necessary force idea and concept about matching different behaviours and so forth. One of the best things you can do is draw up a table and list every single behavioural problem you have in your class, and then on the next, to the side of that, just in the next column, list the way in which you're going to go about dealing with it, and just keep that handy and revise it. And constantly update it. And then when it does happen, this is the basis of a system, right? So systems or processes. Systems or processes. So you're really thinking about the different ways in which to go about handling situations in advance. So you're being very proactive. You've got pre-corrections. Pre-corrections, you've got positioning. So now we're getting to the more, I guess, actual strategies as opposed to, I guess, approaches and things. Your pre-corrections basically means that as students are walking in the door or before you do activities, you're letting individuals or certain students know, sometimes the whole class, but generally certain students, you're saying things like, Johnny, in this particular activity, I'm going to be watching you pretty closely, mate, because last time we did this, I had to get rid of you. You had to kick you out of class because you did this or did that or whatever. So a little chat. You don't have to be as blunt as that, obviously. I'm sort of just trying to invent something here as I go. But pre-corrections basically means you're predicting what's going to happen and addressing it before it happens. And teachers, particularly in early high school years or middle schools or whatever, use tons of pre-correction. And in fact, primary schools use them a lot as well. So positioning, ironing. So positioning and proximity. You're walking around, you're thinking about where things are going to go wrong, and you're positioning yourself in that particular position. So if you're doing some stuff on the board, as soon as you finish doing that, you're thinking about where you're moving to and where you're standing and where you're observing from and who you're helping, which direction you're facing. If there are a group of students here, group of students there, group of students over there, you're not coming over here and sitting down like this because you can't see anyone. So you might come around this side and you're helping students from here, but you can see the whole everything. So that's just basic behaviour management 101. Pre-corrections, again, very, very basic, very granular, I guess, in terms of the whole proactive, in terms of being proactive. So that's 4 or 5. I guess we could write you could give them outlets for energy. We'll call that energy outlet. Yes, noise control is another one. Floor control is another one. Situational awareness. Cool. Okay, so giving students an outlet for energy, which basically means that when you're going through and you're planning out what you're doing, if you do have those attention seekers, you're doing activities now and then that give them an option to be the centre of attention. And it sort of just completely, I guess, not negates, but it allows those, I guess they're more instinctual, natural human type behaviours to exist, but within the confines of a structure or a course or a system that you're happy with, or an activity that you're happy with that means they're not getting in trouble. So that's called movement integration, which is a big thing, particularly when teaching boys, high school boys, upper primary school boys. That was a big thing probably 10 years ago or so, less so now, but is still, movement integration is well known to be very effective. Noise control, so that's managing the volume of noise. If you've worked in Year 9 classes before, it's one of your main concerns is managing noise, and particularly if students are working in groups or pairs or whatnot, because noise is a precursor to lots of other things. Students start being, this group starts being loud, this group starts being loud, this group starts being loud, and so on and so forth, and it just sort of builds until eventually that group's, or this student here starts throwing stuff to this student who starts throwing pencil cases, and then suddenly, students are not working and they're off task and da-da-da-da. So controlling noise is a very important proactive behaviour. It's also reactive. This is probably one that was more in that active category, so it sort of sits in the middle. Floor control. I actually have a strategy. I call it controlling the floor. So have a watch of that one. Or read my blog or that aspect of the book, because that's just, I guess it's more of a personal one. But one thing I noticed, particularly teaching Year 9s, but also applies to primary school, mainly that middle high school area where the physical floor is just a complete mess if you don't stay on top of it. I used to walk around with a bin and get students to pick up every little tiny scrap. And as I was circulating and checking out where they're up to, doing your formative assessment and all that kind of stuff, I would make sure that was spotless. And we'd finish the day or finish that lesson neater than we started. And it would also make sure that their desks stay perfectly straight and perfectly, almost militaristic style, to the millimetre. And that's really important, because I've noticed that when you stay on top of stuff to that level of strictness, it means that it helps control the noise. I think psychologically it does something to students. That doesn't mean you have to be nasty or anything, but it just means that you're very much focusing on all these little control aspects, and it continually, it does something psychologically to kids that just keeps them in the learning mindset. It keeps them in that sort of, I'm not being controlled, but I'm in an environment that's highly structured and I'm here to do certain things and I need to follow these instructions and so on and so forth. So that floor control, I think, is really important, particularly if you let it get out of control. So if you've never been in a class before, you see students walk in, they'll start moving desks around, all this kind of stuff. So staying on top of that is a really good proactive strategy. Seating plan is another one. That's an obvious type thing. And any of those behaviour type contracts you see all over the place, whether it's the red card system or red, yellow, green card system, or any type of individual behaviour plan or individual behaviour management plan or general access plan, or these various different things that are called different things but are all exactly the same depending on where you go. They're all proactive type strategies. Now, reactive, obviously you've got things like consequences, and you've got things like low-key responses. And low-key responses are very simple. Stop it. That's just a low-key response. You've got things like consequences, low-key responses. You've got things like having a chat. So it's a quick little chat to a student. So it can be very simple, where it's just, all right, Johnny, we've got 15 minutes left to go today. If you're not working, there are going to be consequences because that's my job. So what are you going to do? What's your plan? So that we can both go to recess, and I need to go get a coffee and you can stay here, and you can come with me at recess if you want, or you can just do 15 minutes worth of work, and then we'll all be happy and off we go. So you can have a little chat with them. Usually you do that in private, but sometimes you just walk around, you have a 30-second chat to a student, and then you move on to the next one. So you've got consequences, and low-key responses. There's 50 different types of them, but they're any type of response that doesn't really interrupt the class much. That can be a body language thing, it can be a quick little name, it can be just a little click or whatnot. Any of those types of things, even just like a raised eyebrow or a sort of a look, like that type of thing. That quite often is enough if students are doing silent reading and you've got the students' attention. And again, I've got videos on low-key responses and all these different things. I've done videos on most of these and I've written about them extensively. So I'd just go through things and just sort of ramble in these videos, I guess is the best way to explain it. But certainly I'd be reading that information, or some of them are my strategies, but a lot of them aren't, and I've just put my spin on it. So certainly Google around and get different opinions and things as well. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. So consequences, low-key responses, having a chat, error correction, peer prompting is another one. Peer prompting, that's sort of like a positive. Error correction, peer prompting is just a positive take on what is known as the ripple effect or the snowball effect. Two slightly different things, but basically peer prompting is where, and that one can also be proactive as well, but basically peer prompting is where we're talking to one student with the idea that hopefully the student next door will then comply as well. So we might say, wow, you're doing a lot of work today, that's fantastic. Keep it up, and we might have a reward at the end or something like that. It doesn't even have to have a reward. And then you're hoping that the other students lift their game a little bit as well. That's peer prompting. Error correction is basically where we're providing students with information about what they did wrong so that they can then fix it. So if students come into class and they're wearing a hat or they're being noisy, we might say, okay, back outside, take your hat off, walk in quietly, please. And then you say, yep, you did that correct that time, well done, sit down. And so you're going through a process of correcting their behaviour in a very sort of, a structured way. There's various different structures you can use to do that, which again, if that's something that you'd be interested in, I'd watch the video on that, because there is various different models that are out there for how to go about error correction and reprimands. Reprimands is another one. And reprimands are very similar to error correction, except for a reprimand is where we just tell a student they've done something wrong, whereas an error correction is where we tell them they've done wrong and then we get them to fix it. So they get them, usually that means doing that behaviour again, but in an appropriate way. And sometimes we then add consequences to the very end of that process. Sometimes also a reprimand is actually the consequence. So that negative teacher/teacher aid attention is the actual consequence. Okay, cool. So I think that pretty much does it. They're probably the main reactive strategies. There are a lot of ones out. There's a million of them out there that might make sense. Work it off. I guess all of those escalations, all those different types of escalations are different types of, an escalation is the process of reacting to a certain type of behaviour in ever more increasing, I don't want to use the word ferocity, seriousness, I guess, and attention. So that's escalations. Work it off is a common thing that teachers do. So where they say, right, Adam, name's on the board, 15 minutes to go. If you're working properly, you can work that off. And if they misbehave again, you can put a tick next to their name or a cross next to their name or a little whatever. And quite often primary school teachers particularly use this. So they might say, right, I'm putting your name on the board to remind me, I want you to stay in and talk to me at recess. If you're working well, you can work that off and you'll turn and walk in a different direction. So that'll work for some students. It might not work for all. So that's work it off. Also, you've got just that sit outside, which that sit outside can also be a proactive thing. And it can be phrased in a positive way, but quite often it's used by teachers just to calm students down if they're upset, or if something isn't quite working, you might have a student sit outside because they're being way too disruptive or whatnot. If you've walked through any school You'll see heaps of examples of this, just a student sitting outside. It's not considered to be best practice, but that's mainly by people who don't actually work in schools, because there is this idea that you're not teaching kids if they're sitting outside. You can send them outside with a little bit of work though. But in actual fact, what happens is you get more work out of that student and the ones in class by getting them to calm down a little bit outside before you pull them back in. When they get pulled back in, you can put them in different locations and you can pull them in certain conditions and have a chat to them and these types of things. So again, there's a lot to that one. I'd watch my video on that. Or any of my other behaviour ones where I add that in, top 20 behaviour strategies, all this kind of stuff. So anyway, that's just a basic rundown of proactive and reactive strategies and some of the main ones. Again, there are hundreds of these different things, hundreds of proactive and reactive strategies, maybe not hundreds. I think if you knew 50 or 60 of them, you'd be going pretty well. These are the main ones. If you haven't heard of some of these before, then certainly give them a crack, whether you're working as a teacher aide or teacher or whatnot. And just bear in mind that idea that the more proactive you can be, not just using strategies that I come up with, but just being proactive, period, thinking in advance. Okay, this is what I'm going to expect, or this is what I expect to happen in class. And you match that expectation, or you match that prediction with how you're going to respond. So that way, when it actually happens, you're not stressed out and anxious and thinking, oh no, these students they're so misbehaved, I can't handle this class, I'm going to quit, I hate teaching, yada, yada, yada. But if you're proactive and you think, well, this class is going to be a pain, but here's what I'm going to do to try and resolve it. And then you go into class, you try and do those things, provided you're seeing that gradual, so this is over time, and this is that severity thing here, provided you're seeing it going down in that direction and not up, or even not plateauing. If it's going down, then you're doing well and you're doing something right. And then you can go in and you try things, it doesn't work, you come back, try something different the next day, try some different strategies or whatnot, and continually trying to improve it. So that's proactive versus reactive strategies. I hope that helps, and thank you for watching.